Welcome back to Sip and Talk.
Hey, everyone.
We have articles, research bits, your notes. It's a really interesting mix of perspectives here. The goal is to pull out the absolutely essential facts and insights. We want you to get a solid, well-rounded understanding of these topics without feeling, buried in information.
So we'll kick things off with a quick scan of those recent Musk headlines, just to set the scene a bit.
Okay.
Then we're shifting gears to spend most of our time on that huge question. How green are EVs, really, when you look at the whole picture?
The whole life cycle.
Yeah. We'll definitely cover the big benefits, but also the significant, sometimes overlooked environmental and social costs involved in their production and sourcing.
Sounds good.
Okay, let's jump into those recent news nuggets about Elon Musk based on the material you sent over. What's the first thing that stood out to you?
Well, the sources note his recent announcement about ending his special government employee role in the Trump administration.
Right.
Specifically, leading that government efficiency department, or, DOGE.
Right, DOGE. Your notes mentioned this initiative was aimed at cutting federal spending, but it apparently had, limited success and drew some controversy.
Yeah, that's what the material suggests. And that he's planning to refocus on his companies like SpaceX and Tesla.
And tied directly to that government role, the sources highlight his specific criticism of what's referred to as the Big Beautiful Bill.
Ah, yes. He reportedly expressed disappointment that its multi-trillion-dollar tax cuts and defense spending plans would actually increase the federal deficit.
Which, as the material points out, directly conflicts with the whole goal of reducing spending, right? Which was supposedly the focus of his department. Exactly.
It's an interesting moment where, his stated views seem to clash with the policy outcomes.
Yeah.
It really underscores the complexity, I think, when individuals with strong personal views and, corporate interests step into government advisory roles. The sources lay that out pretty clearly.
Okay, shifting orbits a bit, literally the sources give us a SpaceX update. Your notes show that on May 28th, Musk announced plans for the first uncrewed Starship mission to Mars next year.
Next year, wow.
Yeah. The ambitious goal remains a permanent human settlement, apparently.
And for anyone tracking Starship closely, the sources include a key technical detail. He estimated an 80% probability that a previous engine bay issue has now been resolved.
Ah, okay. So a specific engineering update.
Yeah, something the material thought was important to include.
Finally, the sources connect this activity back to Tesla. Your notes mention Tesla's stock price increasing by nearly 7% on May 28th.
Right. And the reported driver. Investor optimism. The material suggests the market viewed his stepping away from the government role as a positive sign, expecting him to dedicate more attention back to his core businesses.
Interesting. What's fascinating here is how these different pieces, a government stint ending, a legislative critique, a Mars plan, can all be linked by the sources to market reaction and investor sentiment around his companies.
Yeah, it really shows how interconnected his various ventures and public roles can be perceived.
Definitely. So that gives us a quick snapshot of some recent headlines. Now let's pivot to the much deeper dive your sources guide us toward, the big question about the environmental cost versus benefit of electric vehicles.
Okay, let's unpack this. The most widely known and, accepted benefit right up front is zero tailpipe emissions.
Right. Clean air in cities.
Exactly. The material you provided emphasizes this significantly contributes to better city air quality and reduces greenhouse gases during operation. That's the clean air you breathe in your neighborhood.
Right. That's the point of use benefit everyone talks about. But the sources immediately introduce the crucial concept of the lifetime carbon footprint.
The whole picture.
Yeah. They make it clear that while an EV's total life cycle carbon footprint is usually lower than a gas car's, the scale of that advantage depends heavily on one major factor.
Which is?
How clean the electricity source used for charging is.
Absolutely critical. And the sources give us a great specific example from Taiwan to illustrate this point.
Oh, yeah.
They state Taiwan's electricity carbon footprint is 509 grams per kilowatt hour, which is comfortably below a threshold of 750 grams per kilowatt hour they reference.
Okay.
Because of this relatively cleaner grid now, EVs there have a 30% lower carbon footprint per kilometer compared to gas cars.
30% lower right now. And the projection is even better, right?
Yeah. The sources expect that gap to widen to 50% lower by 2030 as Taiwan incorporates more renewables.
Wow.
This example really drives home how critical the grid mix is to an EV's overall green credentials, if not just the car.
Definitely not. They even use the Tesla Model S as another efficiency example.
They do. Based on the material, It reportedly has almost 4 times lower carbon emissions per mile than a comparable gas car.
4 times lower.
Especially when charged with clean energy. That's the key qualifier.
So when you're driving it, the benefit is clear. BOT, here's where the sources introduce the significant counterargument and the core tension.
The production process.
Exactly. The production process is the major environmental challenge. And specifically, they zero in on the battery manufacturing.
This is where the significant environmental cost is paid up front. The sources provide some pretty stark data points on this.
Oh, like what?
Manufacturing an 80 kilowatt-hour battery for a Tesla Model 3, for instance, could emit a massive range of CO2 anywhere from 2,400 kilograms all the way up to 16,000 kilograms.
Whoa, that's a huge difference, 16,000. And the sources explain why there's such a big range.
They do. It depends heavily on where and how that battery is made, particularly the energy source used in manufacturing.
Makes sense.
Battery production needs high heat and a lot of energy, and often that energy comes from fossil fuels.
Right.
They specifically mention China, a major battery manufacturing hub, where coal still makes up, 77% of the energy?
77%. So you're building green tech using mostly coal power.
That highlights the challenge, yeah. Building green technology in places still heavily reliant on carbon-intensive power sources.
The sources really bring this point home by citing Tesla's own emissions data from 2022.
Right, their Scope 3 emissions.
Right. Remind us.
That's emissions from their whole value chain, suppliers, logistics, things they don't directly control but are part of their impact.
Got it. So their Scope 3 total was 30.1 million metric tons of CO2.
A big number. And here's the critical insight the sources draw from that data. A staggering 27% of that total Scope 3 figure.
Over a quarter.
Came specifically from metal extraction and battery manufacturing.
Wow. Okay, so here's a key takeaway from the sources then. For a company at the forefront of EVs, a quarter of their total reported carbon footprint is tied directly to just getting the materials and building the battery.
Right. This isn't about driving, it's about making the car.
It fundamentally shifts where the environmental fight needs to happen. It's significantly in the supply chain.
Exactly. So as the sources frame it, this section is about that core tension. EVs offer clear benefits in operation. But the big question presented is whether the environmental and, social costs paid up front in the manufacturing and sourcing of materials is just too substantial to overlook.
That 27% figure really puts it in perspective. Okay, let's really dig into the sources' points about the environmental and social impacts that happen even before the manufacturing getting the raw materials out of the ground.
Yeah, this is where things get complex and ethically challenging based on the material. Let's start with lithium mining.
Okay.
The sources detail some significant environmental consequences tied to this process. Water resource depletion, soil degradation, and ecological damage.
They use the example of the Lithium Triangle in South America, right? Mentioning areas in Chile and Argentina specifically.
In these regions, lithium extraction reportedly uses vast amounts of water from salt lakes.
Vast amounts.
And the material highlights that this exacerbates water scarcity, impacting local farming communities, broader ecosystems, and biodiversity.
And it's not just a potential issue. The sources mention ground subsidence, the land actually sinking.
Yeah, by 1 to 2 centimeters per year in the Atacama Salt Lake area due to this water extraction. That's pretty concrete.
Wow.
And the sources also provide a carbon impact figure for hard rock lithium mining. Around 15 tons of CO2 emitted for every ton of lithium extracted.
15 tons of CO2 per ton of lithium. So the carbon cost isn't just in manufacturing, it starts right at the mine.
It starts right there.
Okay, moving beyond lithium, the sources shine a pretty significant light on cobalt mining.
Yeah, and they address profound social issues here, particularly in the Democratic Republic of Congo, or DRC.
And this is a really alarming detail cited in the material.
It is. Reports suggest around 40,000 children are involved in cobalt mining there.
40,000 kids.
Pointing to serious child labor and human rights issues within that supply chain.
It's incredibly disturbing. It raises uncomfortable questions about the ethical footprint of the materials that power this transition to cleaner transportation.
Absolutely. The sources do connect these mining challenges back to manufacturers like Tesla.
Right.
While they acknowledge efforts towards sustainability like Tesla's aim for carbon-neutral factories, using renewables and developing battery recycling, they also explicitly state that their supply chain depends on the extraction of these very materials, like lithium and cobalt.
It's that dependency that creates the fundamental challenge, isn't it? Even with the best intentions and efforts at the factory level.
Seems so. And the sources reinforce this by bringing back that 2022 Scope 3 emissions data, showing that significant 27% contribution from mining and battery production, illustrating the scale of the hurdle they and the industry are still navigating. It shows that even leading companies in the EV space are deeply intertwined with supply chain issues that have significant environmental and social impacts.
Now, let's broaden the view, as your sources encourage us to do, and connect this discussion to some larger questions and ongoing debates shaping the energy landscape.
Okay. One angle the sources explore is the energy transition itself and what they term the clean power debate.
Right.
The core question they pose is, does widespread EV use simply shift pollution from the tailpipe
to the power plant? Yeah, I've heard that argument.
Exactly. Because how clean an EV is in operation depends entirely on the grid it plugs into.
Right.
How does the current global energy mix, which, as we mentioned, still heavily relies on coal and gas alongside growing renewables, truly affect an EV's overall carbon footprint?
And the sources even briefly touch on the debate point about nuclear power's potential role.
Yeah, suggesting it could provide essential, reliable baseload electricity needed to charge a growing EV fleet without emitting carbon during operation. It's part of that clean power discussion.
Okay. Another significant issue the sources raise is what they discuss as resource colonialism.
This is a heavy one. They frame this discussion around the fact that key materials for these batteries, lithium, cobalt, rare earths, often come from the global south.
From countries in South America and Africa, primarily.
Right. And this prompts the question, as presented in the sources. Does this supply chain inadvertently create a new form of exploitation, potentially echoing historical patterns of resource extraction, where the environmental and social costs are borne disproportionately by, well, less powerful nations?
That's a really tough question.
It is. But the sources don't just leave it there. They also present a counterpoint within this debate. The critical need for greater transparency and human rights review within modern supply chains to mitigate these risks.
So pushing for better oversight.
Suggesting that as a path forward, yeah.
Then there's the big question of future battery technology and what happens at the end of life for these massive batteries.
Right, what do we do with them? The sources talk about battery lifespan and the next steps. They revisit recycling efforts.
They mention Tesla's current reported 70% recycling rate.
Yeah, and their ambitious goal of achieving over 90% recovery through hydrometallurgy.
Hydrometallurgy. Remind me.
It's basically a process using liquids and chemical reactions to recover the valuable metals from used batteries. It's seen as potentially more environmentally friendly than some older methods like smelting.
Okay.
The sources highlight that progress is being made, but significant scaling and technological advancement are still needed. It's not a solved problem yet.
And the sources also discuss various future battery technologies that could potentially help, right? Reduce reliance on controversial materials or improve efficiency.
Definitely. They mentioned developments like solid-state batteries.
Supposedly safer, faster charging.
That's the hope. Also, sodium-ion batteries, which use more abundant materials, and the use of materials like lithium iron phosphate, LFP, or high-nickel formulations in current batteries to shift away from cobalt or other problematic stuff.
So there's innovation happening.
Lots of it happening globally, driven by companies and initiatives like the Global Battery Alliance. But this leads to a broader debate framed in the sources.
Which is?
Can technological progress truly solve these fundamental environmental and sourcing issues? Or is technology always playing catch-up with the sheer scale of commercial demands and the practical challenges of implementing solutions globally?
Right. Can the tech keep pace with the rollout?
That seems to be the question.
Finally, the sources briefly touch on the geopolitics involved.
Yeah, just a mention of the intense competition between global powers like the U.S. and China in the EV market.
And the strategic importance countries place on controlling raw material supply chains.
Exactly. And I also note how key players like Tesla and BYD influence the international energy and manufacturing landscape.
So it's clear this isn't just an environmental or technological issue. It's deeply tied to global power dynamics.
The material shows how intertwined all these different aspects of the EV transition really are.
That brings us to the final debate point highlighted in your sources. The role of the consumer versus the responsibility that the material suggests should fall more heavily on corporations and policymakers.
This is a crucial philosophical question about responsibility, isn't it?
Yeah. The sources raise the idea. Are consumers perhaps too quick to accept the message that buying an EV is automatically environmentally friendly without fully considering the entire picture we've just discussed from mine to manufacturing?
It's certainly an easier narrative to grasp.
Yeah.
Zero tailpipe emissions feels undeniably good.
It does. But the sources present the counterpoint. Shouldn't policy and corporations bear more of the burden for ensuring sustainability throughout the entire life cycle?
Implementing systemic changes.
Right, rather than placing the primary moral or practical responsibility solely on individual choices and purchases.
And this links directly to the policy suggestions mentioned in the sources. They underscore the importance of systemic investment in sustainable mining technology.
Okay.
And actively promoting a circular economy where materials are reused and recycled as much as possible, specifically to reduce the reliance on extracting new minerals in the first place.
The sources even reference a suggestion from UNCTAD. That's the UN Conference on Trade and Development.
Yeah, calling for better recycling techniques and explicitly working to reduce the demand for new extraction.
So it highlights that major international bodies are also pointing towards these larger systemic solutions beyond just what an individual buyer chooses.
Exactly. It's a debate about whether the transition should be driven primarily by individual consumer choices or by top-down policy and corporate responsibility. The sources explore both sides of that.
Okay, so to kind of synthesize the key takeaways from the sources we've explored in this deep dive, EVs offer clear and significant benefits in reducing operational emissions and improving air quality.
Especially, and this is absolutely key, as the grids they charge from become cleaner.
Right, that's the big multiplier.
However, the sources make it undeniably clear that their environmental and social costs in the production phase, particularly involving battery manufacturing and the extraction of raw materials like lithium and cobalt, are substantial challenges that cannot be ignored.
Yeah, we saw that while efforts are being made by companies like Tesla in areas like battery recycling and aiming for more sustainable manufacturing practices, as highlighted in the material.
And those efforts are important.
Absolutely. But significant challenges remain throughout the complex global supply chain.
Understanding the full picture, as the sources guide us to do, really requires looking at the entire life cycle, truly, from the mine where materials are sourced, to the factory where the battery is built, to the road where the car is driven, and finally to recycling or end of life.
It means considering those broader implications we touched on, like the source of energy, the ethics within global supply chains, resource colonialism, and geopolitical factors.
True sustainability in transportation based on this material is complex and decidedly multifaceted. There are no easy answers here.
Well, thank you for taking this deep dive with us, exploring the nuances of EV environmental impact and related topics based on the sources you provided. It's certainly a topic with many, many layers.
It really does underscore that simple answers are rarely sufficient for complex problems like this one.
As you continue to think about this, here's a final thought to maybe mull over, building on the material we've discussed. Think about the sheer scale of mineral extraction that would be required globally if the entire world's vehicle fleet were to electrify in the coming decades.
That's a mind-boggling amount of material.
It really is. Does the potential environmental benefit at the point of use, those zero tailpipe emissions, ultimately outweigh the massive impact of sourcing the vast amounts of materials needed?
And critically, how can we ensure that this transition doesn't simply perpetuate old patterns of resource inequality or environmental damage we've seen throughout history with, say, fossil fuels?
That's the core of it, isn't it? It raises a big question about whether technology alone, like better batteries or recycling, is truly the complete answer.
Or if more fundamental shifts in consumption patterns and transportation models might also be necessary to achieve genuine, equitable sustainability.
Something to think about. We encourage you to keep exploring these complex issues.